Hello, fifth graders. Welcome to the Edgewood Historical Backroads Bike Tour. I'm thrilled to be able to spend today with you. My name is Jo Malicote. I am a retired Edgewood City School physical education teacher. I taught in this building that you call home for all of your elementary years. I taught in this building for 18 years when it was Edgewood Middle School. I was health and physical education teacher. I taught in the district a total of 32 years. That seems like a long time, but I'm not going to tell you how old I really am, but I did graduate from high school 50 years ago this year. I'm so excited to be able to spend today with you. By the time today is over, I hope that you have a better understanding of the history that is literally in our backyards, that we are sitting on top of. The idea for this bike trip came to me more than 25 years ago. My family and I would travel on vacations, and I usually took a bicycle with me because I wanted to go find out about the place where I was vacationing and know more about it. After a number of trips, after several years of doing that with the family, I came to realize that I knew more about the places where I was vacationing, maybe spending a week, 2 weeks, than I did about my own hometown. I was born, raised, went to school, and graduated right here from this school district. And I realized I don't know anything about my home area. The roads that I would travel by every day, the villages that I would travel through, what significance were they? Why was this road named that name? Why was this area named that name? Why was this particular cemetery named that name? And it all became so important to me that I decided that it should be something that I found out about, that I began to explore my own hometown. As a physical education teacher, I realized what a perfect way this would be to not only share the history that I am learning, but to get on our bicycles and one day in the spring spend the entire day traveling the back roads of our school district and learning about those road names and those cemetery names and those village names and the names of the creeks and the names of the rivers. Wherever we were, why are they named what they are named? What is their importance in our vicinity? And I became to understand they were not only important to Butler County and to Clair Township, but they were important in the entire history and the settling of America. How important our little Butler County and Clair Township. I began to find out, I understood, why are we named Butler County? Why are we named Clair Township? The name Ohio. The name Ohio was an Indian name that meant beautiful water or great water. The 4 Mile Creek that I passed every morning on my way to school and every evening on my way home, in the Indian language was called Talawanda. Talawanda is the neighboring school district through which 4 Mile Creek also passes. All of it became so vitally important to me that I wanted to be able to share my knowledge and my understanding with my students. History and physical education did not have to be separated. They could be combined and make it a fun day and things for us to all learn together. Good morning and welcome to the Edgewood School District Historical Bike Trip. It is indeed a pleasure to be able to spend the day with all of our students, to get to be on the bicycle, enjoy the outdoors and the exercise, as well as learning about our history. One of the things that I want to bring to the attention of all of the students today is the vital role that Ohio played in the settlement of our nation and what it took to get this settlement to happen, for people to be able to move safely into the Ohio country, and even the dangers of what people did face when they came to Ohio. It was not the Ohio that we know today. When we look out a window of our classroom, and here at the Edgewood School District, when we look out our 5th grade classrooms, we see baseball diamonds and football fields, and we see farm fields and big open meadows. That is not the Ohio that the founding fathers of Ohio and St. Clair Township came to. It was very different from that. When we take our trip today, we're going to be traveling around portions of St. Clair Township. We're going to begin, down here is the city of Hamilton. We're going to skirt the edges of Trenton, Overpeck, New Miami, 7 Mile, and back again. It's a round trip from Edgewood School to 7 Mile and back to Edgewood Middle School.
Do you know how long the actual trip would be in miles?
If we take all of the routes that are in highlight, it would be right about 15 miles. It depends on how much time we have and if we have to kind of cut something short, but somewhere between 11 and 15 miles. Alrighty, let me hand that chart off to our first student here. Ohio, that we know of today, was not settled in 1803. There were settlers here that were American Indians, that were here as much as 10,000 years ago. Archaeologists, who are scientists who study cultures and find hidden things in the ground. They dig up all kinds of bones and pottery and civilizations. And they have found evidence of Americans, Native Americans, who lived here as much as 10,000 years ago. There are areas in the state that you can go to and even visit now, that such as Fort Ancient and others that are in the nearby area that would give you an idea of what the cultures looked like when the Indians lived here. It was very different than what we would know. Some of the Native American tribes, they had already settled this area, and as you look at these charts, this one in particular shows their roads. They had all kinds of paths and trails all over the state of Ohio, long before white men ever set foot in the state.
How many kinds of Indians were there?
There were at least 5 tribes. There were the Shawnees, Miamis, Delaware, Wyandot, and one more. But there were at least five tribes that called this area, and the Iroquois. And then here's another chart. This is the whole United States. But some of the tribes from all over the country. Here's a couple of more charts that to show how the Ohio being crisscrossed by the various trails that the American Indians used here. When we talk about Ohio and Butler County and St. Clair Township, I want to show you where we sit in the state. The little red square down here in the southwest corner, that's Butler County in the whole state of Ohio. The state actually became statehood in 1803. But long before 1803, there were many things going on here. Pass that one around just to kind of get an idea of where where Butler County is. And here's a picture of the Northwest Territory. Some of you have probably already studied the Northwest Territory. We won't go into that too much, but that's Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and surrounding states that were one of the first settled areas outside of the 13 original colonies after the Revolutionary War. So there's Ohio, where it sits. Today, when we are touring, we are going to be in the northern section of St. Clair Township. It was organized in 1803, the same year that that Ohio actually became a state. Thomas Jefferson was president at that time, and this is not a picture of Thomas Jefferson, but it is the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. A number of years back, one of our 8th grade students from Edgewood Middle School took this picture for me on her 8th grade trip to Washington. And there's the monument reflected in the pool. It's just a beautiful picture. And, oh, there we go. So there's the picture of the Jefferson Memorial. Thomas Jefferson was one of our founding fathers. He was the 3rd president. And during that time was when Ohio became a state. And as we go through the trip today, we're going to be at so many different locations. You're going to hear these names over again and again when I talk about Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin or George Washington or Anthony Wayne, Arthur St. Clair, Richard Butler. All of those names are vital to the settling of Ohio.
So, speaking of the Jefferson Memorial and all that, it looks like there's people in the picture. Do you figure that could be Thomas Jefferson?
This would be tourists during the time that this young lady was actually in Washington for her trip.
You can see his statue in there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the statue, thank you for it. The township, St. Clair Township here in Butler County, was named for a man by the name of Arthur St. Clair. Let me find his picture. And our county was named for a man by the name of Richard Butler. Here is a picture of Arthur St. Clair, for whom St. Clair Township is named. As the day wears on, you will hear me talk more about Arthur St. Clair and some of his successes and some of his defeats. He was a brilliant general during the Revolutionary War and consequently was given a very big job to do by George Washington. We'll hear more about that as the day wears on, as we travel more today. Here is a picture of Richard Butler. He was also a general in the Revolutionary War, well respected. He had 2 brothers who fought right alongside of him, and they were actually known as, imagine this, the Butler brothers. But they were quite a fighting force. The Fighting Butlers, sometimes they were known as. But so Richard Butler is the man for whom Butler County is named. As we go through the day, you'll hear another story about Richard Butler. I usually refer to it as a gory boy story, and it's a very sad story. But nevertheless, Richard Butler had a long career that it's okay that we named our county after this man, even though he had such a tragic end.
So, you said that he fought in a war with his brothers. Did he fight in any more?
They fought, their first war together would have been the Revolutionary War. And then as we go through the day, I'll tell you about another war, which was a battle with Indians in northern Ohio. And it is where Richard Butler died during that war with the Indians, during that battle. Okay. As we are traveling today, I want you to be aware of the fertility of the ground. It's early in the season, so there won't be as many of the fields planted, but there may be some. One of the reasons that so many settlers left the comfort of their homes in the colonies along the eastern seaboard and those first new states, those 13 new states, was how fertile the ground was here. When we're traveling today, you might see fields that are already starting to come up with corn and soybeans, even cane molasses. There are fields around here that are planted in sunflowers and wheat and barley and oats. We have many orchards of apples and pears that come on by the end of the summer. Lots of grapes and so many just small vegetable gardens that individual people grow in their yards. But it was so fertile that bushels and bushels and bushels of corn could be harvested in a season, much more so than out there in those 13 original states. One of the things I want you to think about is the comparison of the state of Ohio today to what it would have been in 1500, 1600, before there were white people here. If we went back 10,000 years or 1,000 years or 500 years to when just the Native Americans lived here, Ohio was nothing but a dense jungle of forest, of trees. Enormous trees so large that if a tree had died, the inside of it, the big trunk of that tree was big enough that a family could live inside the trunk of a tree long enough for them to cut down enough trees to build a cabin. And it's hard for us to imagine trees that large and forests like that. I had a history teacher at Miami University who said that the forests were so thick that a squirrel could get in a tree up here by Lake Erie, and that little squirrel could go treetop to treetop to treetop to treetop to treetop, all the way to the Ohio River, and its feet never touched the ground. Huge canopies of trees, enormous trees. It's just simply hard for us to imagine that kind of landscape because of our openness and our open fields that we have now. So when those white settlers moved in and to make homes and to make farms, they had to cut down trees by the dozens, by the hundreds. And of course, they did not fire up their Husqvarna chainsaw to do that. They had to do it with hatchets and axes and what was called cross-cut saws, where there were two people, one on each end, and they would saw these trees down, and it would take months, if not years, to clear their property. But that's what Ohio would have looked like when our first white men moved in here.
So with the squirrel thing, so they could go all the way from almost Lake Erie all the way down the Ohio River without touching the ground because the trees were that close together?
That close together. That dense.
That's a lot.
Yeah. There would have been oak trees and maple and walnut and sycamore and ash and buckeye trees. Of course, buckeye is our state tree. And as of right now, there are very few ash trees because the emerald ash borer which is an invasive species, has killed most of the ash trees that we have here in Ohio and in the surrounding states. So that's what the Native American children, when they would have been out playing, they were playing in areas like that. Of course, they would have cleared areas too for their own little villages, but that's what the state of Ohio would have looked like at that time. Animals that we have not seen here for decades and decades, generations. There were mountain lions and bears and buffalo, of course elk and deer and coyotes like we have now, but these species that we don't have anymore, this was their homeland as well. As we're traveling today, we're going to see a number of creeks and talk about a number of creeks that the armies, when they first moved in here to settle, we're going to talk about those creeks. There would be 2 Mile Creek, which was 2 miles from Fort Hamilton. And Fort Hamilton sat right on the banks of the Great Miami River, and Arthur St. Clair and Richard Butler built this fort as a frontier camp for them as they began their Indian battles. But as they traveled from Fort Hamilton, they would cross creeks. 2 Mile Creek is the creek, for those of you who know where Flubbs is in Hamilton, that's 2 Mile Creek. As you go on out of town, we cross 4 Mile Creek and 7 Mile Creek and 9 Mile Creek and 9 Mile Creek, and all of those as we head on into Preble County out of Butler County. 4 Mile Creek, we know as 4 Mile Creek because it was 4 miles from Fort Hamilton. In the Indian language, it was called Talawanda because it meant winding waters. That was their name for 4 Mile, was Talawanda. What a beautiful name. As we travel today, you're going to cross a lot of roads, and many of these roads have the names of the original pioneers and the original founders and settlers. Some of you have these names. These are your last names. Maybe your grandparents or great-grandparents have these names. But these are the names of our early settlers in St. Clair Township and Butler County in particular. Names like Ferris, Withrow, Kumler, Long, Cameron, Augsburger, Edwards, Busenbark, Richter, Brumbaugh, Smith, Burkhalter, Houston, Garvey, Jacoby, Warwick, Brooks, Flinner, Flickinger, Landis, McKinney, Gingrich, Cummins, Gephardt, Paulin, did I say Morgenthaler, Pearson, Ritter. As I said those names, I hope you noticed I said some of them in a little more gruff tone to pick up the German heritage of our area. So many of the pioneers were German background. When we get to the cemetery this afternoon, you will see many of these names that I just mentioned on tombstones by the dozens, because there would be so many family members that would be buried there. So these were the names of our early settlers. Ritter Street is the name Ritter was a mill, and we'll talk about the Ritter Mill later today. 7 Mile Elementary School sits on the corner of Ritter Street and Mill Street. So these names have not passed away. They are still in use today. Yes?
So if we back up a little bit from what you said, I was just kind of thinking about this. So you said the things that we don't have, like mountain lions, bears, things like that. Do you think that they could possibly be coming to Ohio in future times?
Oh, absolutely. There have been sightings, as we know, of mountain lions right here in the Butler County area, very close to where we are. Yes, and Ohio has bear a little more to our east, but I would say the time will come when they could very well be sighted up over here in southwestern Ohio. So yes, there was, when I was your age, there were no deer. There were no deer in Butler County, maybe in the whole state. And now, everywhere you look, there are deer. So as time goes on, those native species are moving back in. Coyotes, too, where there were not, I didn't hear a coyote howl till I was much older.
So kind of branching on to that, do you think that we could see an animal go somewhere else in the future and then have one from somewhere other replace it?
They migrate. Animals migrate too, depending upon their habitat. What habitat they need to live, they will find that habitat. So yes, I'm sure that there are animals moving into other places that they've not been seen before or not seen regularly. All right, I mentioned a minute ago about Fort Hamilton, and you saw the picture. And this picture would have been a rendition of the early fort would have been about 1791. And then eventually Anthony Wayne came in a little bit later, and and Hamilton was settled. Where this fort sat is, those of you who are familiar with Hamilton, at the end of the High Street, the Main Street High Street Bridge, sits this Soldiers and Sailors Monument. A number of years ago, back in 1991, Hamilton celebrated its bicentennial, meaning 200 years of history. And what a beautiful picture that is, with the monument and fireworks going off in the night sky behind the monument. Those of you, if you get a chance, get your parents and go through this monument. There's so much Butler County history. Many of you who have older men in your families who may have participated in World War II, World War I, maybe even the Spanish-American War, their names are listed in a catalog in this monument, in the Soldiers and Sailors Monument there on the corner of High Street and probably Front Street, I think is the actual name of that particular. But it's a beautiful stained glass windows, and so it's a lovely museum. I mentioned Hamilton, and Hamilton is named for a man by the name of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was also one of our founding fathers. He was a right-hand man to George Washington. They were really good friends, and many things that George Washington thought and wanted to do, he ran past Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was actually born in Scotland, but he eventually wound up in the United States. The city of Hamilton is named for him. Fort Hamilton is named for him. One of the important things about Alexander Hamilton is that after the Revolutionary War was over, the war had gone on for a number of years, and the men who, here we were as a new nation, the United States of America, but we were a new nation, and we really had no money. We had no money to start anything with, and to begin the process of building. All of the men, the thousands of men who had volunteered and who had been soldiers during the Revolutionary War, had gone back home, and many of them returned maybe to farms and homes that were burned down. Many of them no longer could even find their families. Of course, many of the men died in this war. But Alexander Hamilton came up with an idea. And one day he presented an idea to George Washington that said, how about if we pay the men who were soldiers? We don't have any money, but how about if we pay them in land? Now, Alexander Hamilton's title, once the United States was formed, his title was Secretary of the Treasury. If you were in charge of the Treasury, what would you be in charge of?
Probably money.
There you go. But as I just said, we didn't have any money. We were broke. The Revolutionary War was financed on the back of our founding fathers. Many of them had plenty of money, and there were other people who helped pitch in. And they would just dig a little deeper into their pockets each time that we needed more money for food and clothing and ammunition. And so, but as a nation, we had no money to begin our actual, to show the world that we were a nation and that we could take care of ourselves. Yes?
So, was Alexander Hamilton also known as Alexander the Great?
No, Alexander the Great was a Greek. We would have to go back several thousand years to get to Alexander the Great.
Is Alexander Hamilton the guy that they wrote that musical about?
Yes. Alexander Hamilton is the man that the musical on Broadway was written about. And he is, isn't that odd that here we are this many years later and he is so famous? But when Alexander Hamilton said, President Washington, we don't have any money, but we have land. Now, at that time, the United States was not all this big, but we didn't own, the United States government did not own all of this land, but here it sat. And Alexander Hamilton's idea was, let's pay these men in land. They can move if they're brave enough to have fought a revolution against the greatest army and the greatest navy in the history of the world, then they're brave enough to move out of these 13 little colonies and states along the Atlantic Ocean and go find a new home for themselves out in this land, out in this rugged, harsh land. So this was one of Alexander Hamilton's biggest contributions, was the idea of let's move on. Let me give you that poster to look at. I'm going to send around another picture. This one in the center, we've already kind of looked at these before, but this is Arthur St. Clair again. And Anthony Wayne, and we'll talk more about Anthony Wayne a little later in the day as we travel to some other spots on our bicycles. This gentleman here, John Cleves Sims, is also extremely important in the settlement of Ohio, but we're not going to talk about him today because we're just mostly focusing on St. Clair and Butler and Wayne. But Sims is someone that you would probably want to first get some information about if you wanted to pursue more about Ohio history. This gentleman, for those of you who live down in Trenton, this is a man for whom your village was first named. His name is Joseph Bloomfield. He was the 4th governor of the state of New Jersey once the Revolutionary War was over. He was very popular. He was a good governor, and the people really liked him. But as they left New Jersey after Alexander Hamilton gave them the opportunity to move on, many of them took him up on the offer. They left New Jersey and they headed west into Ohio. When a man by the name of Michael Pierce came to what we now know as Trenton, he originally founded a village, and they named the village Bloomfield. Many of you have parents and grandparents who went to Bloomfield Elementary School, and that is where the name came from. It was from Joseph Bloomfield, and eventually the village was named Bloomfield. It became Trenton, but nevertheless, Bloomfield Elementary School is a way of honoring the early history of the village. And that's Joseph Bloomfield. Ohio is also known as the mother of presidents. We have 8 presidents who have been born and raised here in the state of Ohio. All around the state. We have as close as Harrison, Ohio, which is just over down close to Cincinnati, is the burial place of one of Harrison's. Pass that one around.
So do we know what's the most presidents that have been born in one state?
I don't know. I don't know about other states, but I do know that Ohio has been called the mother of presidents. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are on our 45th president, so I don't know what other states would have their numbers. Just another picture here of Richard Butler. We'll talk more about him again as the day does wear on. When the settlers left those 13 states and they headed west into Ohio, they did not get a U-Haul truck and attach it to their Ford F-150 and get out on interstate something or other and start traveling and move all of their things. Their only way of traveling was by a horse and a wagon, some kind of a buggy. And I have some pictures here to kind of show you what the early settlers, how they would have traveled. And when they're traveling, let me move this one up here first. This is a picture of a village. And I want you to notice, it's more of a drawing, but I want you to notice those muddy streets. There was no pavement. There was no gravel or asphalt to pave a street with. It was just mud. So in snowy seasons and rainy seasons, it was just a mess to try to travel through someplace. But here's a picture of a wagon and a team of mules or horses that would have been typical for farmers and people to travel in. You've heard us talk later today when we get to the village of 7 Mile. We're going to talk about that Route 127 was a stagecoach route. A stagecoach was just an enclosed wagon with teams of horses pulling them and a driver. And how many of you have ever heard the term, I want to ride shotgun? I want to be the shotgun rider. Have you ever heard that term? Well, the man who was not driving was the security for the driver and for the passengers and the cargo. Inside would have been the people. Up on top would have been their luggage and other things that they would be taking from one place to another. So one man was the driver and the other one was the shotgun rider. He was there to help protect against robbers and Indians and to keep everybody safe. So in today's cars, if you're riding shotgun, you're riding next to the driver. But that's what a stagecoach would have looked like. Also in 7 Mile, you'll hear us refer to mule teams. This is a team, this was actually there are 20 mules attached to this wagon back here. That one could carry a lot of cargo because of the number of horses and mules that would be attached. But there might be one with 1 mule, 2 mules, 10 mules. So all kinds of different combinations. These two I want to draw particular attention to. These two pictures are covered wagons, slightly different styles, but basically the same thing. They both have what are called oxen attached to the front, teams of oxen. They're not cows, they're not horses, they're not mules. They are somewhat like cows, but they were very big and strong and they could pull these wagons. America was settled by settlers, by pioneers who packed everything that they owned that they could get into one of these wagons. And they set out on journeys across the mountains and across the prairies and across these jungles of forests to settle what we now know as the United States of America. So when you put your things in here, you did not take everything you owned. You took the absolute vital necessities and put it in that wagon. And you hoped for the best and you prayed to God that you would get from where you were to your destination. Some people didn't even know where their destination was. They just decided to leave and go to seek their fortune and find what they could find. And set up a new farm, go to a new village, find a new life in some way or another.
So all these pictures that we're finding, how did they actually capture these? They didn't have cameras back then.
These pictures are a little more modern, particularly this one. This one would be maybe from even like a reenactment somewhere. It is not uncommon in the summer months for there to be reenactments. In other words, people who like history come together and for maybe a weekend or a week or two, they may live out the life of the pioneers. They will reenact battles like Civil War battles or Revolutionary War battles. And but this one looks like it could be a little older. There was photography even into the probably 40s and 60s. By the 1860s, definitely. So there would have been pictures that date back to particularly the settlers that headed on to California and Oregon after the Civil War. One of the things that I have heard said that the heart of a place is in the story of its people. And as we travel today, I want you to think about the people who settled here. Most of you here are 10 years old, 11 years old, and the world did not begin in 2009 and 2008. Our history here in Ohio goes back, as settlers, goes back well over 200 years. And as we said, 10,000 years or more for the Native Americans who live here. So we're going to talk about a lot of people and a lot of places and a lot of history. And I hope you take back some fun stories to share with your families tonight. There will be a few of the stories that you probably don't want to share at mealtime because they're going to be kind of gruesome. There will be other stories that you would want to share and just say, you know what, their family really isn't any different than our family. There was mom and dad and kids, and this is what they did, and these same things that we do in our lives. It was not convenient for our founding fathers to drop everything they knew and get into one of those little wagons like the picture that's passing around currently and put everything they'd had that would fit in that wagon and say goodbye to every person that they knew, knowing they would never be back to speak to them again, never be back to hug them again, never be back to visit the graves of parents again. They were leaving and they were going to go find a new life. It wasn't convenient and it wasn't easy, but they chose to do it nevertheless. The Ohio flag is one that's a little different from most flags of other states, and it all has historical significance. The round O just stands for Ohio. Somebody count the stars on there for me.
17?
17. Why do you think we would have 17 stars on the Ohio flag?
Is it maybe something that has to do with like counties or townships or something?
We were the 17th state. 17. Now see where the 4 stars are out there beside themselves?
Yeah.
So if you take those 4 away from the others, how many do you have left?
13.
13. What's the significance of the 13?
Isn't it the 13 colonies?
13 colonies in the 13 original states. So we were the 17th. So that last star out here at the far end is our star. So we are the 17th. And it's called a pennant, the way that it has the swallowtail out here on the end. So the Ohio flag is different than some other state flags, but it's very well designed, and so you have to be extended around. Let's take a closer look at it as well. When I was talking about how hard it would have been to travel into a new place, particularly when you would be leaving, not just leaving the 13 original states to come out into a new land, but if you were leaving Europe, America was settled by immigrants from England, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, France, Germany, name all of Austria, name all of the nations of Europe, and beyond into Asia. We are a nation of immigrants. But those first people who left Europe and came to America, came to these colonies, it was not an easy trip. I want to read you a clip, a segment of something that was written by Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, as we know, is one of our founders. He was a scientist. He was an inventor. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He signed the Constitution. And here is what he wrote about traveling on a ship across the Atlantic Ocean. Imagine being in this kind of condition and situation. We can't even understand this. It was an act of courage. It was written of the transatlantic crossing. During the voyage, there is on board these ships terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, many kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headache, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and the like, all of which come from old and sharply salted food and meat, also from very bad and foul water, so that many die miserably. Add to this want of provisions hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, anxiety, want, afflictions, and lamentations, together with other trouble. The lice abound so frightfully, especially on sick people, that they can be scraped off the body. The misery reaches a climax when a gale rages for 2 or 3 nights and days, so that everyone believes that the ship will go to the bottom with all human beings on board. In such a visitation, the people cry and pray most piteously. In other words, it was awful to cross the Atlantic Ocean in these boats in those early crossings when the European settlers were coming into America. As I'm closing, there's a couple. Oh, we have a question.
How long would it take
To cross? 3 months? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And once again, you had to bring with you what you were going to need.
What happens if they run out? Like everybody runs out, would they all just die?
They would just die on board ship. Many ships went down. There were many ships that never made it to
Because they
to
all
the-
died from thirst or hunger. or whatever.
shipwreck, terrible storms. They didn't have any of our GPS kinds of systems. They were just operating off the stars and trying to get to where they were going. Nothing like any of us can imagine. And in my own case, I've been able to trace my lineage back to German and Swedish and English and Scottish settlers. And when I personally think about what my ancestors went through to get here, I have such pride in them. And that's part of what I would want. If I could wave my magic wand and make all of you in this room today proud to be Americans and to be patriots and to love your country, I would do it. I would just wave my magic wand and you would all realize how lucky you are to be born as American citizens. But beyond that luck of being born as an American citizen, what it took for you to be an American citizen. I have here just simply one picture. It's entitled Winter at Valley Forge. And it's a picture that shows the suffering of the men who were there with George Washington that winter as they were in the Revolutionary War. In fact, I have a young man sitting right over here. Would you read what is written at the bottom?
Winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania was a period of great suffering for the Continental Army. Washington and the French General Marquis de Lafayette led their discouraged troops through several months of hardships, including bitter cold and inadequate shelter, and shortages
Inadequate.
Inadequate.
and shortages of food and clothing.
These men spent the winter, and not just these men at Valley Forge. Many of these camps of soldiers during the Revolutionary War. It is said that you could track them. You could track them in the snow from the blood because they didn't have shoes. They had rags tied around their feet. None of us can understand that kind of cold. It's just something that none of us can imagine. To go without food, to go without clothing, to go without shoes, to be that cold, and to still believe in what you're fighting for. One of the last things that I want to say before we leave the room and get on our bicycles and head out today is about what our founding fathers went through. And when I use the term founding fathers, I don't mean just men. Every one of these men, 99% of them were married. They had sons and daughters. They all were in that together. So our founders were male, they were female. They put everything on the line to make this country happen. I have here just a little cardboard box of some documents that I ordered from Amazon. These documents cost me almost nothing, $5, and they are copies of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. One of them is the Gettysburg Address that Abraham Lincoln gave about 100 years later, 80 years or so. This is the Bill of Rights, of which is many times under assault even to this day. These documents cost me, like I said, $5 or $6. The men who chose to sign the Declaration of Independence, here's their pictures. The men who chose to sign the Declaration of Independence, once their signature went onto that parchment, they became wanted men. They were, at this point, they were now traitors to the English crown, to the King of England. They were wanted men, and the king wanted them dead. And he was going to do everything he could to bring them to their knees, and as a nation and as men individually. There is also a little kind of a cute, sort of a funny little fact that on the date of July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed by these men, that over in England, King George wrote in his personal journal, his diary that day, "Nothing memorable happened today." Little did he know that these men who had signed that declaration on July 4th, 1776, were going to change the history of the world. One of these men, his name was Abraham Clark. This is just an example. Abraham Clark had two sons. His sons were captured by the British, and Abraham Clark was given the option. You can take your name off the document, you can scribble out your name, or we're going to kill your sons. And Abraham Clark chose to leave his name on that Declaration of Independence. I have two daughters, and every year when I'm standing here talking to all of you students, I say this because to me it's something I need to think about. I have two daughters. Abraham Clark had two sons. Do I believe in anything strongly enough that I could stand up and say, I have to choose between my children and my beliefs? Abraham Clark had to make that decision. We know that one of his children did die on a British prison ship in Boston Harbor, in New York Harbor, where he was starved to death. And many examples of these men their children were taken from them, their wives died of disease, their farms were burned to the ground. None of it came easy, and it was at a great cost that our nation the United States of America was destined to become the great nation that we were. So as I said a minute ago, if I could just wave my magic wand and make all of you understand and know what it took for you to become to be the descendants of these brave American founders, I would just hope that you could understand what it took and to be proud of your nation. So as we travel today around St. Clair Township here in Butler County, I want you to embrace Ohio and know that you are part of living history. We're not just out here all by ourselves with no significance. We go all the way back to George Washington and the early days of the founding of the United States of America. Have fun on your bikes and let's roll. Now, girls, I have a special message for all of you. Boys, I want you to pay attention as well, but girls, this is specifically for you. Today, while I am going from stop to stop and talking about different people that we are going to be discussing, soldiers and generals and business owners and shopkeepers, men who were running mills, whether that was a grain mill or a sawmill or farmers, I'm going to mention the names of a lot of men. History doesn't usually recognize the contributions of women to the degree that it recognizes the contributions of men and the impact that women have on history. So one thing I want to tell you as we prepare to head out of here today is that for every man that I am mentioning, every soldier whose name we don't even know, we just know there were thousands of men who helped with the Revolutionary War. Every one of those men had a mother. Many of them had a sister, a wife. And those women were just as instrumental in the winning of the Revolutionary War as their husband or their brother. And I want you to remember that just because their names aren't as prominent, that they were just as important. There were women in the Revolutionary War who were spies. Maybe they worked as in a tavern as a waitress, just like waitresses do today. And they would overhear the men talking. They would overhear British officers talking about what their plans were. And these women would then report what they heard to General Washington, to Nathaniel Greene, any other man that they knew of importance that needed to know the information. Some women were actually soldiers. There are a few documented reports of women who dressed as men and spent their entire time in the service of the American Army dressed as a man, and the men didn't know it, that they were fighting right alongside a woman. They would tie their hair up or cut their hair, dress as men, and do whatever it required of them to keep their identity secret. There are women who played many roles. There was an organization called the Sons of Liberty, and right alongside of them was a group called Daughters of Liberty. By 1766, 10 years before the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Daughters of Liberty already were a functioning group. One of their group, her name was Sarah Fulton. Sarah is credited with being the brains behind the Boston Tea Party, of which you probably have studied. The Boston Tea Party was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back when she convinced a group of men to dress like Mohawk Indians and throw all the tea over the ship into the Boston harbor, and that really got the British angry. The British put up blockades, and they would not allow goods to come into the country. So many of these women, the Daughters of Liberty, they would get together as groups and raise money for the troops. They would get together and spin yarn to make clothes for their husbands and their brothers and any of the soldiers in the groups, in all of the army, of the American Army. So not just the American Revolution, but all throughout history, women have played a vital role. I don't want you to think that just the men, because as I sometimes refer to them as the founding fathers, we had just as many founding mothers. There was a woman who we refer to as Molly Pitcher. Molly fought alongside her husband, and when he was wounded, he shot a cannon in a battle with a group of soldiers. He was wounded. Molly took up his job, and she continued until the battle was over. She ran his cannon. Before she was running his cannon, she was carrying pitchers of water to the men. It was the Battle of Monmouth. It was a hot, awful time, and she was carrying pitchers of water to the men. When her husband went down, she put her pitchers down, and she ran that cannon for the rest of that battle. Many women that made their contributions. So not just the Revolution, but the Civil War, the First World War, Korea, Vietnam, the Second World War. Women are currently soldiers. There are so many different ways that women have roles. This summer, while you're sitting around on a hot summer afternoon and you're kind of bored and you don't know what to do, I have a challenge for you. I want you to open up your computer, and I want you to go to Google or whatever you use, and I want you to type in just different things: women in history, women in business, women in science, women in mathematics, any topic that you can think of. Women in fashion, women in filmmaking. Whatever is your passion, look into what you can find in history about the women who contributed to whatever it is that you feel so strongly about. History is changing and giving women more opportunities that girls didn't have. When I was your age, we didn't have the things that you do, sports teams and activities that you currently don't even think twice about, weren't even available to me 50 and 60 and 70, nearly 70 years ago. So I want you to take the time this summer to learn about the women who have contributed to history throughout all periods of history. So girls, thank you for giving me a few minutes of your time before we head out on our trip. We're going to have a great, fun day. So boys and girls, let's learn a lot about our history. Thank you. As we're traveling today, I want you to notice those road signs and the village names. Of course, I will be mentioning them, and the men and the women that I'm going to talk about. I want you, by the end of this day, to appreciate and to just imagine what it must have been like to be a 1700s and 1800s person with no electric, no running water, no tractors, no cars, no vans, no pickup trucks. Everything that you did with your hands, and you did with the knowledge that had been passed down to you from generation to generation, that you could do everything that you needed to do without a Walmart or a Sherwin-Williams paint store or a Kroger grocery store, anything without a telephone, you knew how to do everything. You didn't have to Google anything because you had it in your head. You knew how to make life survivable, and your community thrived. Also, while we're traveling, I will a few times mention our Native Americans who called this area home. Those 5 tribes that shared the state of Ohio and used the area that we know as Kentucky was their hunting grounds. Those 5 tribes, when they realized that their homeland was going to be taken over if they didn't fight back, these white settlers were a threat. So consequently, the Indian Wars are not something that we should be surprised about when we read about them in our history books. They were fighting for their survival. And I won't go into the politics of all of that, but it's all history. Those are things I want all of you, as you are getting ready to get on your bicycles, to think about. It's not the 21st century today. Today we're going back into the 1700s, the 1800s, and even before, when some of the things that I'll be talking about. So let's have a great day. We've got a beautiful day. We have Butler County Sheriff's deputies who are going to be on their motorcycles. They're going to be in their cruisers. They will keep us safe. I want us to just be completely paying attention to them and your teachers. As we travel today, there will be many cars on the other side of the road. Don't be rude. Wave to them, talk to them, and just enjoy the day as we explore Edgewood's back roads. All right, everybody, saddle up.